And another woman with a similar case, she floated up above the hospital, she claimed, and said that, there's a red shoe on the roof of this hospital. And somebody, incredulous, went up, looked for it, and found this red shoe. Or another case like this, a guy who said that when he was going through surgery, he found himself floating up to the ceiling and then up through the structure of the building and then into another room where he looked around. It looked like a hospital wing and nobody around. But in all of these rooms, there were people in the beds, but they weren't really people. They were mannequins that had IVs. What a strange dream, doctor. What do you make of that?
Welcome to the Kalos Center podcast. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Kalos Center podcast. Our guest today is Michael Zigarelli. Mike earned his BA in economics and history at Lafayette College, an MA in industrial and labor relations at Cornell University, and a PhD in human resource management at Rutgers University. He's held academic or administrative posts at several universities and is currently professor of leadership and strategy at Messiah University. His work in the fields of management and practical theology, law, and ethics has appeared in a number of scholarly and popular publications, and he's authored over a dozen books, many of which concern Christian leadership in various contexts, including business, ministry, and sports. He and his wife live in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and are in the business of raising 4 children. Actually, they're all grown. I think they're all in their 20s. So, Mike, welcome to the Kalos Center podcast.
Oh, thank you, Jim. It's an honor to be on.
Okay, so you've obviously done a lot of work on Christian leadership and what that looks like in professional contexts, and you can share a bit about that. But what I want to focus on in our conversation today is some recent work that you've been doing on near-death experiences, specifically what implications they might have for Christian theology. But I'd like to start with a couple of personal questions that I pose to all of our guests. And one of these is how you came to faith in the first place. When and how did you convert to Christianity?
Oh, well, I was, on my motorcycle on I-95, high on cocaine, driving down the road, hit a pothole, fell off the bike, had a tractor trailer coming at me. And I said, God, you get me out of this, I'll give my life to you. Truck went over me, wheels on both sides. Didn't get a scratch, and here I am. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. You can edit that out if you want. My story isn't nearly that dramatic. It's not near. It's interesting because it's a conversion story, but it's not one of those kinds of stories. In fact, it's not an Apostle Paul Damascus Road story at all. It's more of a Peter go kicking and screaming story. I mean, I was raised Christian, but quite nominal during my teen years and as an undergraduate in college as well, just kind of living for myself and very much a cultural Christian. But around my mid-20s or so, I started looking more closely at the faith and asking deeply, what do I believe and why do I believe it? And basically, what do I disbelieve as well? And I reached the intellectual conclusion, I guess, that Christianity is true. And so one day I just decided, I guess need to follow Jesus, and I need to take that intention. I need to do that intentionally. And it's sort of C.S. Lewis story in a way. He gets on the motorcycle as an atheist, gets off the motorcycle as a Christian. Nothing particularly fascinating happened in between. It just like, okay, well, this is truth. This is reality, and that's kind of the way it was for me as well. But it's had countless implications, of course, as the faith does. I mean, not just how it's influenced my character and my choices, my public and my private choices, but also my closest relationships, as well as the work that I was doing at the time. New academic, sort of a new intentional Christian. And what did Christianity really have to do with the things I was teaching and researching? Leadership, management, business, and our work generally. And that led me down a long and kind of circuitous path as a student of those questions and as a researcher in practical theology.
Okay, very good. I think that's just as dramatic and powerful a testimony as the one you started with, the fictitious one that demonstrates the power of the gospel to turn a life around, as God did with you. So you've touched on this a little bit, but when and how did you come to see doing work in the field of leadership as a significant way to apply your faith?
Yeah, well, as I began taking my faith seriously, I guess I realized that there is indeed a direct connection between our faith and our work life. And in fact, everything in my field proceeds from a philosophical foundation, as I guess it does in every field. So my question shifted from essentially what works to what is God's will. All right. So, for example, instead of researching and teaching about how to lead effectively, I began teaching how to lead faithfully. Right. Not just about how to lead in a way that works, in a way that gets people to follow, but how do I lead in a way that does, in fact, honor God? And that's been a 25-year journey of teaching and writing and speaking. And around that same time, I also created a personal mission statement, to teach Christians how to live and to lead more faithfully, to teach Christians how to live and to lead more faithfully. That's been my lens. And it's led me to give up tenure at a fine school and teach elsewhere that was a better mission fit, that is. Led me to formalize my theological education at Yale and Liberty in their seminaries. And now it's leading me to explore some of the greatest questions of our existence, including, where you want to go with this interview today, which is the question of what happens after we die.
Right. Very good. So you have done significant research in this area of near-death experiences. As a recent article of yours in the Christian Scholars Review demonstrates, your article is entitled Near-Death Experiences and the Emerging Implications for Christian Theology. The whole topic of NDEs has taken off in recent years, both in popular culture and in scholarly circles, though there's been some resistance in the latter realm, as critics complain that these phenomena cannot be rigorously investigated for reasons that we'll talk about. But let's start by simply defining our terms. What is a near-death experience?
Yeah, well, it's curious. Even after 50 years of research in this field, there's no standard definition for the term near-death experience, at least according to some of the top NDE researchers. And if you don't mind, I'll use NDE occasionally as a shorthand here. But one definition puts it really nicely and in plain English. NDEs are events that take place as a person is dying or indeed already clinically dead. Events that take place as a person is dying or indeed already clinically dead. And whether those events are objectively real or imaginary is hotly debated, of course. But one thing's not up for debate, and that is that these experiences are universal.
So, okay, they're universal. How common are they?
Exceedingly common. I mean, reports of NDEs will transcend generations. They transcend worldviews. They transcend cultures. I mean, they've always been part of the human condition. And as far as their numeric prevalence, we have some psychometrically sound surveys over the decades that have estimated that between 4 and 9% of people claim to have had an NDE. All right, that's on the lower bound, somewhere between 4 and 9% of the general public. So if you do the math, Jim, I mean, on a planet of 8 billion people, that puts the number of NDEs in the hundreds of millions, and there are a lot of common features across all of these highly prevalent experiences. Researchers are unanimous, though, that no two of these are exactly alike. But there is this recurring pattern in the accounts, and your audience will have heard of some of these. I mean, the phenomenology, or at least the blissful version of the phenomenology, tends to include some kind of combination of an out-of-body journey and seeing one's body from above, and joy and serenity and painlessness and traveling through darkness or through that quintessential tunnel to a place of indescribable beauty. It might include meeting spiritual beings or deceased loved ones, maybe a life review, a review of one's life, communicating with a supreme being of light and unconditional love, before maybe reaching a boundary and then returning to one's earthly body, either voluntarily or involuntarily. I mean, some people's experience it might be one or two of these elements. Other people might be nearly all. And one of the really fascinating things, like even the blind, even people blind from birth have reported some of these same elements from their NDEs. And children have too, maybe fewer elements, but they have too. Some differences. I mean, children are a little more likely than adults to meet a deceased grandparent or deceased pet. and they're almost always accompanied into the light by some sort of luminous being holding their hand. But otherwise, the narrative arc is strikingly similar regardless of their age.
So, as prevalent as these are worldwide, why is the study of NDEs, why has it been this long before it became such a phenomenon? It wasn't till the late 20th century that this really took off. Why did it take so long?
Well, there are reports, NDE-like reports throughout history across the world. I mean, it's a well-known phenomenon recently, for various reasons. I'll get to that in a second. But across civilizations throughout history, we've had we've had these kinds of reports. I think modern resuscitation techniques, CPR, defibrillation, intubation, EMS availability, and so on, are bringing more and more people back from the brink of death. And so maybe that's why we're getting more NDEs in the last 50, 70 years or so. But plus, there's probably a lot more people reporting near-death visions as well. And the personalized, kind of ubiquitous outlets of social media will amplify these accounts and carry them to the ends of the earth. So it may be an accelerating phenomenon, or it may just be an issue of accelerating reporting of NDEs, but it certainly is exceedingly prevalent.
So, from an investigative standpoint, what would you say are some of the more important or interesting NDE accounts?
Oh, there are so many. I guess one way to think about this is that there are categories of these corroborated accounts, at least three categories. There are accurate reports about events that happened near the body of a person who was unconscious. There are accurate reports about events away from their body, things that they saw away from the operating room or wherever. And then there are accurate reports about deceased persons that they met. So there are these three big categories. And then within those, maybe I'll just pick out a couple of the better known cases that maybe some people have heard, others haven't. But this first category, reports about stuff that happens near the body, those kinds of events. Typically, that's somebody that says they're floating near the ceiling in the operating room during their surgery. Classic cases like a guy whose dentures were lost, but he knew exactly where they were because some nurse had pulled them out and threw them into a crash cart. Nobody knew where they were. That guy did a couple days later when he awoke from his coma. Said that nurse put him in that crash cart. He was exactly right. Somebody floating near the ceiling who memorized a 12-digit number that was on top of one of the monitors in there, and she was exactly right about what that monitor was. Or somebody else who saw when she allegedly floated near the ceiling, a red sticker that was on the ceiling fan pointed toward the ceiling. She was right about that. Somebody saw a 1985 quarter on a cardiac monitor on the top of it. They were right about that. Or what doctors were wearing, or what they were saying, or what equipment was used. I mean, most famously, there's this case of Pam Reynolds, which a lot of people have probably heard of. She was in early 1990s in brain surgery. They cooled her body down to 60 degrees to do this surgery. Total shutdown of the brain, monitored it closely, so that there's no brain activity. Even put these primitive earbuds in and had this clicking in her ears at 95 decibels so that they can monitor whether the brain was doing anything while they were going through surgery. Obviously, it was not when she was cooled to 60 degrees. But notwithstanding, Pam Reynolds saw her operation. She heard the comments being made. She knew the kinds of tools that were being used in her surgery. Just stunning, corroborated evidence. All of these under the umbrella of accurate reports near the body. So that's one category. If I could just real quickly, I'll go through the other two categories. The even more fascinating to some people are events away from the body. Some people might say, well, yeah, they knew what was going on in the operating room because there was this residual brain activity that picked it up. But what about, this woman who went through surgery, but knew that outside on the third floor of the hospital, there was a blue shoe, man's left shoe, that had a wear mark over the little toe region and the shoelace tucked underneath the heel. How'd you know that? Well, I kind of floated up there while I was unconscious, and I noticed that. And she was exactly right about that. And then another woman with a similar case, she floated up above the hospital, she claimed, and said that, there's a red shoe on the roof of this hospital. And somebody, incredulous, went up, looked for it, and found this red shoe. Or another case like this, a guy who said that when he was going through surgery, he found himself floating up to the ceiling and then up through the structure of the building and then into another room where he looked around. It looked like a hospital room or hospital wing and nobody around. But in all of these rooms, there were people in the beds, but they weren't really people. They were mannequins that had IVs. What a strange dream, doctor. What do you make of that? And the staff looking at each other like, oh my goodness, how did he know this? Because in the next floor up, there was a nurse training center with medical mannequins in there that had IVs hooked up to them. There's no way that somebody should know this. There are people coming back with information they absolutely should not have. And so, that's all in the category of accurate reports at a distance, away from the body. And then these other reports of meeting deceased persons, little kids who meet somebody who claims that they were, I'm your brother or I'm your sister. They were never told about them because that sibling died before the patient was born, and they're absolutely right about these things. Right, so hundreds of documented cases like this, highly probative evidence in this case for near-death experiences, in the case for the afterlife, and it brings us much closer to essentially establishing proof of this. And the last thing I'll say here is, through it all, the naturalist position is becoming much weaker. I mean, whatever internal causes they want to cite for NDEs, whether it is residual brain activity or oxygen deprivation or the anesthesia was wearing off or it's a hallucination or a dream, whatever internal causes they might want to cite for this, they really can't overcome this externally verifiable information. I mean, it implies an otherworldly explanation, a supernatural one rather than a naturalistic one.
Okay, good. So you've really anticipated my next question in some ways, and that is that there is a criticism that's often leveled by naturalists or others that are skeptical about these claims, that there's a kind of religious bias that, all of those who claim to have had these experiences, they're giving us subjective reports. And, all this is really a kind of reflection of religious beliefs that they had in place. And so their expectations regarding what might be experienced on the other side, that's impacting the reports that they give. What would you say to that criticism?
Well, a couple things there. You have the subjectivity objection, and then you have the religious bias objection. What a skeptic will call subjective in NDEs is what a detective or a court of law might call eyewitness testimony, or a form of direct evidence that in and of itself can prove a fact. So, what the skeptics are discounting here and just tossing out as subjective, tossing it out so blithely is actually considered compelling evidence in a court. Secondly, with regard to the religious bias, yes, there is some religious bias in some of the research, basically starting with a conclusion and then seeking evidence to support it. Or maybe it's just a reflection of their cultural bias, their upbringing, or what have you, right? But the same thing is happening with anti-supernatural bias. Basically assuming, or basically adopting, I guess I should say, the presupposition that there is no supernatural. Right, so there must be a natural explanation for everything that happens. Right, the brain and the gap theory. There's a gap in our knowledge. Let's assume that the brain did it. It's happening on both sides. So I say yes. Look for the biases in the methodology. And when you find them, throw out the study if you want. I mean, the case for life after death does not require those kinds of studies to show that it's more likely than not that some NDEs are real. But I agree with these objectors. We need to be logical in this quest for answers, not ideological. On both sides, the religious side as well as the sort of atheistic scientific side.
Very good. So could one supplement your response just now by also pointing to cases of NDEs where what is experienced actually contradicts the expectations of the person who has the experience, say atheists. There are cases of atheists who have NDEs that actually are so powerful um, as a confirmation of theism in terms of what they encounter on the other side, that they convert to some kind of theism, be it Christianity or some other religious perspective. Would that also work as a response to that objection?
Well, sure. That's very powerful, because if you're going to object that people just see what they expect to see, and in many cases they do, because we all see through a cultural lens. So, I mean, that's something we certainly can talk more about, whether we're all seeing the same thing, but we're interpreting it differently. Some ancient Greek sees a column of light, whereas a Christian sees God, whereas somebody from medieval China sees an emperor, but they're all seeing the same thing, interpreting through a cultural lens. It's entirely possible there. But when somebody who does not expect to see, say, Jesus Christ in their NDE does see him, and there are plenty of stories like this. I'd invite people to read maybe John Burke's most recent book on near-death experiences for some of these stories. But what do you make of that? I mean, when somebody reports something that they had zero expectation of seeing, that's a harder one to explain away.
Yeah, we could also recommend Howard Storm's book, My Descent into Death. Howard Storm was an atheist art professor back in the 80s who had some internal bleeding that killed him for, I don't know, he was down for several minutes. And he reports in his book that he experienced Jesus and angels, and he came back a firm believer in Christianity. That's a powerful testimony along those lines.
Oh, sure. Yeah. We have atheists becoming Christian pastors. A couple of those stories out there. We have a story of a mobster, a guy in a crime family, for goodness sake, who comes back from his near-death experience, leaves the crime family, becomes a social worker. They let him go, and he completely, his life is radically different. There are these sort of bizarre stories of transformation, but they're quite compelling. I mean, that's it's probably one of the most consistent findings in the research, actually, is that people come back different and they live differently, and it's one of the most observable as well. They lose their fear of death. I know what's next, so because I've experienced it. They might lose their fear of life because they're going to live life to the fullest and not worry about what anyone thinks of me. Some of them return with a radically reformed purpose, like you're talking about here, and there's actually some really solid peer-reviewed A-level research on this in medical journals that demonstrates the difference between people who were resuscitated and reported a near-death experience and those who were resuscitated and didn't report a near-death experience. How are they different now and in 2 years and in 8 years from now? There's it's like test group, control group, and almost a very, very tight, valid scientific experiment there. So good evidence that there's something going on here. And, the changed lives, a major pillar in this case for the afterlife, alongside of the prevalence of NDEs and the pattern of NDEs, as well as these corroborated accounts.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have deep and lasting personal impact. Now, there's another kind of criticism that comes from, those who are skeptical because of certain theological reasons. And the worry is that NDE accounts may conflict with biblical orthodoxy. In your CSR article, you claim that NDE accounts actually confirm or are consistent with important Christian doctrines. Can you review some of those?
There's some aspects that comport with Judeo-Christian doctrine, and then a couple that may be a little bit off center. But if NDEs are real, right? That's the premise. Veridical is the technical term here. If they're real, then there are several implications that are consistent with Judeo-Christian doctrine. One implication is that a supernatural realm exists, right? A world beyond our own. And frankly, for that to be false, then that would mean that all the NDEs would have to be false or imagined in some way. All right, so it's a high probability implication here that there's a supernatural realm. That's one. Another implication is that a supreme being exists whose essence is light and unconditional love. It's actually one of the most common elements in these reports, dating all the way back to Ray Moody's 1975 study that coined the term near-death experience. Every day, people all over the world are coming back from temporary death saying, I met God. All right. And of course, testimony about God doesn't equal existence of God, but the sheer volume of so many similar testimonies does carry some weight, and especially in the absence of plausible alternative explanations that fit the data. So there's the supernatural realm and there's the supreme being of light and love as a couple implications. And another implication would be that there is, in fact, an afterlife for human beings. All right. Consciousness survives physical death. There's indeed this duality of mind and body, as René Descartes said hundreds of years ago. And there are also heavenly and hellish trajectories on which our essence may proceed after physical death. I mean, there's at least a preponderance of the evidence for an afterlife. In other words, the evidence for some kind of afterlife is more likely true than not. It possibly even meets the higher legal standard of clear and convincing evidence. But the point here is each of these implications flows rationally from the data and comports with Christian theology.
Good. So you also note some points of tension between certain common elements of NDE accounts and traditional Christian views. What are some of those?
Yeah, well, most basically, there's the question of who gets into heaven. Right, those reporting a blissful or euphoric NDE were seemingly on the trajectory to a paradise. And these folks come from all different worldviews and belief systems. I wrote down this quote from the Handbook of Near-Death Experiences. It's from Janice Minor Holden, who is really sort of the doyen of this entire movement here. She said this in summarizing the research. She said, people of every religious affiliation have reported NDEs, including Buddhists, Christians of all denominations, Hindus, indigenous religious adherents, Jews and Muslims. Religious non-adherents have also reported NDEs, including agnostics, atheists, and people who describe themselves as spiritual but not affiliated with an organized religion. She goes on to say, several researchers have found no relationship between the NDEers' religious affiliation or non-affiliation prior to their NDE and either the incidence, contents, or depth of their near-death experience. Now, end of quote there, but that doesn't mean that NDE evidence conflicts with Christian doctrine of salvation. Not necessarily. I'm not sure that the research conclusions need to be interpreted that way, but without a doubt, they do highlight these conclusions do highlight an apparent tension, which leads some Christians to be wary of NDE stories, even rejecting them altogether as counter-biblical.
Okay, good. So what else? What other points of tension might there be?
Well, I mean, if a blissful NDE indicates that someone's en route to heaven, right? And if people from almost every worldview are reporting this sort of blissful experience from their NDE, then our question becomes: how broad is the scope of salvation, right? Or more colloquially, you might say it as what do NDEs mean for who's in and who's out of heaven? Well, one possible inference from the NDE data is there might be what you might call a wider aperture to enter heaven than is traditionally understood in Christian theology, and not the gateway, so to speak. It's not the unbounded aperture of universalism, given the reports of hellish NDEs. Can't be that unbounded aperture, and it's probably not the anything goes aperture of pluralism. As the data can't disprove that Jesus opens the way. So it's not like all roads lead up the mountain to God. But at the same time, the NDE evidence does imply that there might be an aperture that's less narrow than this narrow gate is sometimes interpreted to be by Christians. Right? And it really invites a fresh conversation about the extent to which God's grace will extend to the world through the resurrection.
Yeah, I tend to see it the same way. I find it interesting, sometimes confusing, that while you have many NDE accounts uh, that confirm a doctrine of hell of some kind, you also have others that seem to point towards universalism, or people who will say, that this is what I learned on the other side, is that everyone is saved.
Mhm.
And I'm sure that just the very fact that there are conflicting reports on that score gives some people pause.
Yeah, well, but ever since academic study of NDEs began in 1970s or so, the literature has described these, you talk about hell, these distressing near-death experiences, not just the pleasant ones. And they range from falling into a dark abyss to terrifying events, demonic beings, and so on. And it's hard to get percentage estimates on that because people are reluctant to share their trauma. But the some of the best estimates we have, trying to factor in the reporting bias, are maybe a percentage possibility in the mid to high teens of all NDEs.
Mm.
Whatever the actual number is, though, of these hellish experiences, it appears to be non-zero. Right, and that's in accordance with Christian theology, and it's a direct empirical contradiction of universalism.
Good. So, to what extent, if at all, should Christians be willing to allow NDE accounts to impact their theological convictions, or how they interpret certain biblical passages?
Yeah, that is a great question. Also, a hotly debated question. I think the antecedent question to all that is how do we discern truth? Right? Of course, Christians discern truth through Scripture, but they may also be aided in that interpretation by reason and by tradition as well. How a passage has been interpreted by countless smart people throughout history, as well as by our experience and observation, as with science, right? I'd say that things like reason and tradition and experience are subordinate in this process. They're kind of hermeneutical adjuncts, if you will, but I think they're essential. And, yes, I do recognize the potential slippery slope, if you will, of using experience as a filter here, as a hermeneutical filter. I mean, it can lead us down that path to subjectivism, but it's important that we distinguish between these private experiences, or one or two things that people experience, which I don't think is a source for theology, versus the more public experiences, almost the universal human experiences, which NDEs are in this category, which I think can be a source for theology.
Mm.
So, applying all that to these experiences that we call near death, question becomes, where are they in this experiential continuum? Is it the minority, tiny minority? Is it universal? They're somewhere in between. Well, they're growing in number, they're growing in consistency. So as a result, I think they're also growing in their ability to legitimately inform theology.
Good. So, if we approach this scientifically, and the current state of research on NDEs is becoming more rigorous, scientific in its approach, we could look at it as maybe similar to certain other fields of study in the sciences, certainly down through scientific history. Certain findings have impacted how we interpret certain biblical passages, whether we're talking about the creation story in the early chapters of Genesis, or that account, I think, in the book of Joshua. There's, a declaration that for 24 hours the sun stood still, and many Christians down through history, theologians, biblical scholars, took that to be more or less directly strong biblical evidence for geocentrism. But with the advance of astronomy, and now today, I think we all agree, or most of us anyway, that, well, what the biblical writer was providing there was a kind of phenomenological description, right? That is consistent with a heliocentric view, because it's an indirect way of reporting something about the rotation of the earth, or just this, that, from the experience or the point of view of the people at the time, the sun didn't move, and it was miraculous, and who knows how God did it, but it's not really evidence for geocentrism.
Mhm.
So maybe as NDE research continues, It can provide another pool of data that can impact how we interpret biblical passages, so long as we don't do so hastily.
Yeah, no, that's a really trenchant point you're making here, I think. I mean, you think back 400 years or so to Galileo, what was his high crime that got him essentially sent home for the rest of his life? He was on house arrest for his whole life. Why? Well, because he proved the Copernican theory mathematically that the Earth rotates around the sun rather than the other way around. Church didn't like that, right? The church said, no, actually, way we've interpreted Scripture is the Earth is the center and everything, and it's static and it doesn't move. And obviously, he wasn't saying the Bible's wrong. He's saying our interpretation of the Bible is improvable, right? Well, some of these NDE researchers, I don't know how you feel about this. I get your perspective on it. Some of these NDE researchers might be the Galileos of our day in a way, if they're coming forward and saying, look, we're just interpreting the data here. Maybe your interpretation of Scripture is improvable. Here's what we've observed, and it seems to be a pretty compelling case.
Yeah, again, it wouldn't be the first time in the history of science that new data has shown us or revealed to us certain assumptions that we were making that we didn't even recognize as presuppositions we were bringing to experience that are questionable, right? That, well, maybe this assumption we're making is the problem. The problem isn't some false claim in Scripture. The problem is not the data that we're getting from science. It's the assumptions we're bringing to our interpretation of Scripture. That's a lesson that has had to be learned and relearned over the centuries, hasn't it?
Well, yeah, I get a lot of pushback from Christians when I speak about these issues. I do. I mean, preached on this this summer, and some people were intrigued by it. Other people, I mean, it's one or two left the church. The pastor got more pushback that week than he'd ever gotten, in his 10 years at that particular church. Well, why are you bringing in people like this, talking about heresy, talking about things that are absolutely satanic? Clearly, these NDEs can't be true because they contradict the Bible, et cetera, et cetera. So there are Christian skeptics. And I think we need to have that conversation. And then there are atheistic, agnostic skeptics as well, and other types also. But as a social scientist, I'm just trying to come at this dispassionately, kind of as a detective. Let's look at the data and follow it where it leads.
Have any of your own theological convictions changed as a result of your research in this area?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if anything, they've been solidified. I've been looking at this question for about 3 years now, sort of deeply. And I mean, there's been lots of confirmatory evidence that we continue on after physical death. It's something I've always believed, but I mean, now we have some pretty strong data that points in that direction. It's kind of the way I felt after reading Lee Strobel's Case for Christ. All right, I believe Jesus is divine, but now we have data-driven evidence here. Really strong, airtight case, nearly pointing people to the most reasonable conclusion that Jesus Christ is, in fact, the divine Son of God. Right. So, at the same time, as much as this is confirming my former beliefs and bolstering them, it's causing me to think a bit more deeply about the nature of God, about how much He really loves us, and how He wants each of us to be with Him now and forever. So it sent me back in a number of ways, and I hope that others will take a fresh look at their faith as a result of it too.
Yeah, I find that very encouraging. In fact, this seems, at least with regard to the positive, blissful NDEs, it seems a nearly universal aspect of this experience of unconditional love, right? That you get that over and over again. That can't help but be encouraging. In fact, people who have this experience struggle to put this into words. It seems almost ineffable that it will speak in very hyperbolic terms about how imagine the greatest experience of love that you've ever had and multiply that by 10,000, right? They do their best to try to articulate this. But one thing is for sure is that the experience is just overwhelmingly powerful. And I don't see how that could be anything but
Mhm.
encouraging.
Well, it certainly should be encouraging. At the same time, if it contradicts our previous beliefs, then some people are going to clearly push back against it. But I really think that believers should see this as an apologetic opportunity rather than as a threat. I mean, increasingly especially in the Western world, people have kind of folded their arms and glared side-eyed at arguments based on holy books or religious tradition, right? I mean, that's not Christians. This is others have kind of looked at things that way, and to more and more people, none of this religious stuff is considered knowledge. It's merely faith or its opinion or its preference. And so from their perspective, it's basically, you might call it inadmissible evidence in this case for life after death, or God, or anything supernatural. And that's why so many of our theological arguments often fall flat with this audience. Right? The Bible says. I mean, it essentially ends the conversation. And the same thing with, God
Mm.
says, or Jesus says, or the Vatican says, or anything else that others are going to interpret as dogmatic religious grounds for belief. But Christians, I think, might benefit from a more, I might call it penetrating apologetic. And begin with the rational worldview of the skeptic to offer empirical arguments for the afterlife. For example, arguments like, here are 3 lines of evidence for life after death, right? And using the NDE evidence that way, or something along those lines, right? With some audiences, that might even become the ultimate apologetic. Why? Well, because it respects their assumptions about epistemology. Their assumptions about legitimate grounds for knowledge and for belief. And that's not to discount the value or the truth of the scriptures. It's simply to suggest a shrewder and more innocent approach to pick up on
Mm.
Jesus' words. And the same thing that the Apostle Paul did in Athens, talking to the Greek philosophers of his day. You taking a shrewder approach with them rather than telling his Damascus Road story or going through the Jewish scriptures or something like that. Point is that with some people, the science of life after death may be a better starting point than the scriptures on life after death. And
Mm.
that science suggests it's at least more likely than not that we survive our physical death.
Yeah, and connected with that, I was having a conversation with J.P. Moreland in an earlier episode about how NDEs also confirm what is the predominant historic Christian view of human nature, that there is something supernatural about us. Call it mind-body dualism, or whatever. There's a spiritual aspect to us that's irreducible and that's confirmed by these NDEs, where you have actual thinking and experiences, perceptions that happen independently of brain activity, in cases where there's a corresponding flat EEG. That certainly seems to confirm a kind of mind-body dualism.
Well, it sure does, and in most of these cases, you're going to have a flat EEG. It's not often measured because they're trying to save this person's life, so they're not measuring brain activity. But typically, the brain shuts down 18, 20 seconds after the heart stops and we stop breathing. So you got clinical death, and then the brain shuts down shortly thereafter, but you have people reporting several minutes of memories after that correspond to whatever's going on in the operating room or what have you. It's exceedingly compelling evidence of this dualism, right? Of non-local consciousness, as some people call it, that, our body is one place, our mind is someplace else, soul, psyche, whatever you want to call it, it's someplace else, right? And so that is, it's a debilitating blow to physicalism.
Mm.
All right, debilitating blow to atheism, even to agnosticism, if we start seeing that this dualism is in fact real and demonstrable.
Which could explain in turn some of the reluctance in certain quarters, certain scholarly quarters, to even acknowledge this whole domain as a legitimate area of research, right? If they perceive a threat to their worldview or the metaphysical assumptions that underwrite, their research program as
Yeah,
physicalists, they're not going to be motivated to pursue this in an
yeah.
objective way.
Well, the scientific starting point, naturalism, physicalism, the mind and the body are one thing, not two. And so they work together and they die together. Right. And but if that's going to be my starting point and that's going to be my presupposition throughout my science, that's a pretty unscientific assumption that I'm bringing to the table. Right? Why are we putting those kinds of constraints on? Why are those kinds of parameters and insisting that the supernatural does not exist? So that's a real challenge. That's a real problem, and it should be cross-examined, I think, by thoughtful folks who are seeing these data for what they are. I mean, genuine evidence for life after death.
No matter what our worldview, we're all susceptible to allowing our scientific research to be, biased in favor of certain metaphysical commitments. And that's why, again, no matter what your worldview is, it takes great circumspection, self-control to conduct your research in a fair and as objective a way as possible. Whether you're super religious or, a hardcore naturalist. One other thing, there are also doctrines in my, kind of informal study of this topic. I've noticed certain Christian doctrines, not only get confirmed, but at least the way I conceive of them gets enhanced. And here's an example. The whole idea of divine judgment. I think it's very common for Christians to take a kind of wooden view of that and think about, well, people will be standing before God and he's going to make these declarations and for good and bad, for better or worse, for reward or chastisement. And it's as simple as that. But what you get in a lot of these NDE accounts, and again, this is very common, as you know, people reporting that when they do a life review, which seems to be, again, according to the reports, something like a video or maybe a hologram or something, but they're seeing it all in living color and kind of reliving it, but not just from their point of view, but they report experiencing the different events in their life from the standpoint or perspective of all the other people who were involved. So if you lost your temper at a certain point with your children, or your parents, lost their temper with you when you were a child, you're experiencing their emotions from all their perspectives. And that means both in response to the good things you did and the bad things you did. And so, if this is how it works, it's a much more rich, full-bodied, existential kind of experiential version of divine judgment than, most people had ever imagined.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. And many people who say they've gone through a life review come back saying, yeah, I saw everything I ever did and everything I ever thought and everything that other people who were affected by that were thinking and feeling at the time. But even in my worst moments, this divine being before me communicated nothing but unconditional love and acceptance. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would send you back to the woodshed on this question of God's judgment, as you're talking about here, and what that really entails and what that really looks like when we're on the other side.
Very good. Well, this has been great. I like to conclude each of our conversations now with a question that, again, it's more personal, and that is on your view of the meaning of life. And in this case, I'd like you to kind of reflect as you answer this question on your view of the meaning of life, on how your study of NDEs has impacted your view on the meaning of life.
Yeah, okay. Gonna end with a real softball question here, huh? What's the meaning of life? Well, look, there are straight up theological answers like, what's the meaning of life? Well, it's to glorify God and enjoy Him forever, right from the Westminster Catechism. Or there are these Old Testament answers like, fear God and keep His commandments, for that's the whole duty of mankind. It's the end of Ecclesiastes. And then there are New Testament answers to the meaning of life, like, seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, which Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, or to continue with Jesus, the great commandment, right? Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. It's going to echo of the Old Testament, codified in the New Testament, right? So you have all these different varieties, all these different versions of the meaning of life that I find attractive. But I'm also attracted to, as you were just saying here, what we're learning from the data, from these eyewitness testimonies, what people are saying when they return from an NDE and they've had this this life review, this panoramic movie or holograph that they've seen, this highlight reel displayed by this spiritual being that they refer to as God, and they say that what was emphasized there. And this is going to be germane to the whole meaning of life thing. What was emphasized in that life review wasn't their worldly achievements, but the times when they cared well for other people or when they neglected to do so. And they come back thinking, it may be the expressions of love that matter most in life. Leading them to infer after an NDE that love is in fact the true meaning of life and should be their priority from that point forward. Why are we here? Well, to love people well and to keep God at the center of our lives, they might say on the back end of a near-death vision. A lot of the rest of what we do, it's just a monument to our own ego. But bottom line, the NDE evidence here aligns quite closely with what Jesus said when asked, what's the great commandment? Love God, love people. It's about as succinct as it gets on this timeless question of the meaning of life, and that's kind of straight from the red letter credibility of Jesus himself. But lastly, as far as the application to my work and career and how it's all connected, I think this principle fits really well with a reminder that I've kept close to my heart from the Old Testament book of Micah. The old prophet writes, "Never again worship the work of your own hands." Never again worship the work of your own hands. If the meaning of life really is to love God and to love people, then our work and our accomplishments need to be the means to those ends rather than an end in themselves. And yeah, that might be common sense, but perhaps, unfortunately, it's too uncommon in practice, at least in an American culture. So, hopefully that answers your question, but that's kind of where I've converged at this point, based on the scriptures and based on the science of NDEs that I've been observing.
That's great. Yeah, and it's really just what we would expect or hope for, given the recurrent biblical message that God is love. Right? There's really nothing surprising there. It's a nice reinforcement of what we should have known all along.
Amen.
Well, thanks, Mike. I appreciate this so much, and God bless you in your continued work.
Well, thanks. Thanks for your ministry, and I'll be listening. All the best with this new endeavor of yours.
All right. Thank you, brother. Thank you for listening to the Kalos Center podcast. We gave you our thoughts. Now let us know what you think. Email us at podcast@kalos.center.